Hi, my name is Emily Olson. I am the senior editor for Moby Health News here for HIMSS TV. I'd like to introduce my guest. Can you tell us about yourself and your name?
My name is Sirj Goswami. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of InsightRX.
So tell me a little bit about what your company does and what you're here particularly to talk about today.
We're a precision medicine technology company, but we have a unique focus on precision dosing, right? So what we do is solve the last mile problem of precision medicine, which is once you've identified the right therapy for the patient, how do you then proceed to optimize that therapy, right? So we solve that last mile problem by leveraging patient data and provide the optimal dose recommendation to the clinician.
And why is this such a big need for the healthcare system?
The clinical problem that we're directly trying to solve here is the issue of drug failure, right? That's caused by one-size-fits-all dosing approaches. And there are two sides of this story, right? The first side is lack of efficacy. So the drug just simply not doing what it's intending to do, right? So for example, if you give a type 2 diabetic patient metformin, the expectation is that the HbA1c level or the glucose level for that patient is going to go down. So if it's not doing that, then the drug is not being efficacious. So lack of efficacy is a big concern. The other side of the story is toxicity, right? Adverse drug reactions are one of the top 10 leading causes of death in the developed world. More than 1 to 2 million roughly hospital stays each and every year is impacted directly from adverse drug events. So, and if you look at the data, what's surprising is that roughly half of these events are avoidable, and roughly half of these events are dose related, meaning if we can simply identify the optimal dosing recommendation for a patient, there's a lower likelihood of a toxic event occurring and a higher likelihood that the patient is going to achieve an outcome that's desired. So drug failure is the issue that we're trying to solve here.
So what do you think are some of the populations that are most affected by this issue where they're not getting the right dose of the drug?
Yeah, and this sort of goes back to how drugs are developed in the first place, right? So if you look at the drug approval process and even upstream of that, how drugs are actually studied in the clinical trial process, what you'll find is that drugs are typically studied in a very constrained patient population. Yet once it's approved, once the medication is approved, it's used much more broadly, right?
It's for everybody.
And it's for everybody, right? So the clinician's going to actually administer that medication to vulnerable patient populations that have not been well studied, that have not been well characterized in, say, a phase 2 or phase 3 trial, right? And so some of these vulnerable patient subgroups include, women who are breastfeeding, right? Patients that have kidney dysfunction, liver dysfunction, patients that have some kind of comorbidity, right? So these are all subtypes that are vulnerable in the real world, right? Because we don't know how the drug is going to work in these patient populations. So it is critically important, at least from my perspective, that we start to get to the source of the problem, which is, when drugs are developed, let's start thinking about how do we start individualizing therapy from the beginning. And then once the drug is approved, we need to have the right mechanism in place to study the drug in different patient populations and have an iterative approach in terms of how we decide to optimize the therapy over time.
Gotcha. And I imagine that's a huge population, like women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, people with kidney disease or any other comorbidity. I imagine that's just a large amount of Americans.
It's a lot of patients, and it's understandable. Like, it's impossible to study the drug in every patient subgroup during the clinical development process, and I completely understand the perspective of a biotech and pharmaceutical company, but that doesn't mean that as an industry as a whole, that we shouldn't think about how we can optimize the whole process better, right? Meaning, like, how do we get precision dosing into the drug approval process? How do we incorporate precision dosing at the point of care? How do we start thinking about how the drug is going to behave in different patient populations? It's more about setting the foundation and having the right mechanism in place to start uncovering these signals, right? One stakeholder in the broader healthcare ecosystem is not capable, right, of solving this problem alone. We need help, pharmaceutical companies need help, providers need help, payers need help. So we have to all kind of work together as a community to solve this problem.
Yeah, and can you tell me some of the impacts, maybe both from a patient perspective, but also from a provider perspective of just kind of being unsure of what dose of a drug to give someone? Absolutely.
So we focus on, at least as of now, complicated medications, right? So these are drugs that typically have a narrow therapeutic window, right? meaning there's a sweet spot when it comes to dosing. The efficacious dose is very close to the toxic dose. We focus on drugs that have a lot of variability, meaning if you give the same drug at the same dose to, say, 100 different people, they all respond differently. So, that variability is not wanted, right? You want, if you're going to give the medication at a particular dose, you want a predictable response, essentially, right? So providers are looking to minimize that variability in clinical response. They're looking to improve clinical outcomes. I can give you a couple of examples. One of the drugs that we optimize is a antibiotic called vancomycin, right? It's a drug that's used a lot across the entire healthcare ecosystem. It has a narrow therapeutic window. It has a lot of variability associated with it. But there are clinical problems associated with misdosing, right? Meaning, if you don't give enough dose, then you might not be able to beat the infection, right? Mm-hmm. But if you give too much of vancomycin, which happens actually fairly often, there is a risk that the patient is going to get what's called acute kidney injury, right, or nephrotoxicity, which is essentially kidney damage. So from a provider perspective, they want to minimize the likelihood of an AKI event occurring. And at the same time, they want to maximize the likelihood that the patient is going to respond to the drug with respect to efficacy. So that's just one example. As you can imagine, there are so many drugs, so many therapeutic areas that stand to benefit from individualization. Some of the areas that we focused on to date include, as I mentioned, anti-infectives, medications that are administered prior to a bone marrow transplant, chemotherapeutic agents, immunosuppressants. These are all medications that are challenging, very complicated, and clinicians are looking for solutions really to tailor the dose so that efficacy can be maximized and toxicity can be minimized.
And as I've asked pretty much everybody today, so how has COVID impacted your business? Has it changed anything for you?
It hasn't changed anything fundamentally, but it has been something that we've had to deal with, which is quite challenging, right? Because sure. COVID's impacted everybody, and especially for us, hospitals and health systems have been particularly impacted, of course. Clinicians have been impacted, and one of our primary stakeholders or buyer, essentially, in a hospital health system is the pharmacy department. Mm-hmm. And the pharmacy department has, in particular, has been hit pretty hard because they're responsible for vaccination. But despite all of that, despite this sort of this headwind, hospitals are still focused on improving patient safety, right? That is a first and foremost concern amongst all the health systems that we're directly partnering with, and because of that, precision dosing hasn't been, really pushed by the wayside. It's people are still thinking about how do we implement solutions that improve patient care and maximize patient safety.